I feel like you're much further down the path of the topic tonight than probably what you realise. There are many things just by turning up to something that enhances your trust. And this evening I want to spend some time picking apart the idea of trust and what maybe we can do from here to help enhance that. I always feel like it's worthwhile, I think there's a lot of wisdom in being able to stand still and think through things that you instinctively know to be true. And so you're not drinking your own Kool-Aid or the Kool-Aid of the masses about, well, that's just what everyone does, therefore it must be good, but stopping and thinking as to why that is the way it is. As an example, we probably all know that health, being healthy is a good thing to do, and it affects positively every area of our life. Now, it would also be fair to say that being healthy is a multiplier to every area of our life. I mean, it itself, being healthy, is life itself, right? Yep. You don't have that, you don't have life. And if you get that right, it multiplies your days. It multiplies what you can do within your days. But if you don't stand still and think your way through about what are you proactively doing to make that a multiplier in your life, you just kind of go by doing things. You know you're supposed to drink water, but if you're not deliberate about a strategy around drinking water, you go, well, I get it through my coffee consumption, so therefore I'm drinking water. Do you know what I mean? Like, you just end up with the default. So hopefully tonight's just going to be a bit of a moment in time for all of us where we can stop and pull apart the idea of trust. And what I want to end up with tonight is with you leaving this evening and you having a conversation in the mirror, and maybe with somebody else of whom you may get to connect with here at some stage, around being deliberate and more deliberate about trust. Putting trust as a strategy in your life, not a tool for manipulation, but a strategy for growth and affecting positively those that are around you. Does that sound like a good plan?
Yeah.
Excellent. So, do you remember with as you think through trust? Do you remember? Oh, this might just be me, but actually, I in my previous when I was in my late teens and early to mid 20s, I worked within an organisation that actually wasn't far from here, and I lived just down the street. So before this was renovated, this used to be my old stomping ground. And when it used to come to trust, right, it's you had a real immature version of trust when you were late teens, early 20s, because you'd walk into an environment, and if somebody thought you looked at them the wrong way, or they looked at you the wrong way, or the partner you were with, you looked at them the wrong way, or you look at somebody else's partner the wrong way, like there's this massive mistrust, and then boys will be boys and stupid things happen. There's this immature version of trust. But as you get older and you gain more experience and you get the hell out of that industry and you move into something more productive, you understand, like when it comes to personal relationships, there's this other level of trust that happens as well, right? It's like you through the years of experience with your significant other, there's been enough evidence being shown and enough demonstrations of trust that you can faithfully trust them. Does that make sense? It's not blind faith, it's belief based on evidence that you can trust them. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so we know these things to be intrinsically true, but we also know commercially this is a big thing too, right? Because of the area of business that I'm in, I come across, when I talk to businesses, SMEs or large corporates, you often discover there's a lot of solutions or problems that you or you know people who can solve. And I've got a bit of a sweet spot for vehicles in particular. I understand that industry quite well, and so it just tends to be something I naturally gravitate towards. We were recently in the market for a new car. We've taken delivery of a new one, but that process was interesting to say the least. Now I know that space very well. I've got some excellent contacts in there as in that automotive space, and I was fortunate enough to get to a brand in which I know I get fleet pricing for myself personally. And so I knew the vehicle I was after, and I knew what I wanted it to be. So when I met the dealership, but with the dealership, by the way, the dealership principal goes to the school that my kids go to school. Like he's past school, but his kids go to the same school. and so there was a certain level of trust, like a bit of a commonality, like you don't know them, but you're in the same room, there's a bit of something common ground to talk on, right? So that was about the vagueness of our relationship. I couldn't get in front of him, but I got in front of his sales manager. And because of what I do, I generally come across opportunities within fleet. Cut a long story short, I had after we sort of had a conversation and sort of learned what each other does and why we do what we do, and of course they're on their best behaviour, aren't they, right? And I let them know there was an opportunity for a vehicle fleet that was for executives which was 19 vehicles, and I was working on some other projects, but I've discovered this, and I think if we get your vehicle in their hands, this could be a good exposure for you, be a good thing, right? This is a normal thing to be doing. Plus, it's me before I'm in the purchasing stage, like just making sure we're getting everybody on side, right? And so, anyway, as you'd expect, and unfortunately as the industry is rife with, I mean, you are looked after exceptionally well, right? Everything's beautiful, everything's right on time until the moment you sign the order, right? And they get your signature going, it's right now for you to go and order the car and make a commitment, right, for the dealership to go and make the commitment for that vehicle. And the ink hadn't even dried, and the first bad experience, boom, straight away. And then the delivery date changed, bang, and the delivery date changed. And I rang at one time and I said, I was expecting a phone call yesterday for that promised delivery date. This is the third time. Oh no, it still hasn't come off the ship yet, off the boat. And it's like, where's the communication? You know, and so what do you think happened? This is the commercial trust thing, right? Where do you think that 19 vehicle fleet opportunity went to? Actually, where do you guess it didn't go to, right? It's because if they couldn't even get one vehicle right in terms of communication. Like, I've ended up in the right car, thank God, it's the right colour, like everything's fine. But do you know what I mean? Like, it's just, and we've all had experiences, maybe on both ends of that spectrum. Maybe you've been the one that's on a learning curve, right? Maybe you've been on the other one that has received that poor service. But commercially, it impacts you. True. But so commercially, it makes a huge difference. If you lose trust within somebody, it has a knock-on effect and a multiplying effect negatively, just as it does positively should you do the right things. Now, we all know, we've all heard that jobs are being replaced, right, thanks to technology. And if you notice that any role or task that can be described, any process that can be described is the thing that's being automated and outsourced, because you don't need a relationship for it. You don't need trust with those things, do you? I remember as I left the defensive tactics space, and I was told, and I learned at that time, that one of the best places to learn business development was in the pharmaceutical industry. And so I went into the pharmaceutical industry. By the way, I got in there. I would spend my nights teaching people martial arts and go to boot camps and so forth around the country, teaching military, special forces and aviation security officers their defensive tactics, close quarter combat for counter-terrorism, right? It was a really cool thing to talk about, particularly in a venue like this on a Friday night, right? But, yeah, got you nowhere. That's right. But what I discovered was that there was during that time, I was training a guy who I didn't know who he was at the time, but him and one other person started a airline that's based out of here in Brisbane, right? The was Virgin Blue, now Virgin Australia. And they started that, and I was training the gentleman who, along with Richard Branson, started that company, his son, and I didn't know at the time the actual HR director who was in charge of the recruitment strategy, which was interesting, for that company as well. Along comes 9/11, and they talked to myself and another instructor there who had the relationship and said, hey, we need to be doing something that's proactive, and that's how kind of that company then evolved from there. It wasn't our IP, it was just our relationship that we'd done such a good job on enhancing and adding value to. I remember one time with one of the guy's sons at a local school to here actually, and parents were running late, and nobody knew about it. It was just late, and I was sitting there with his son waiting. The sun's getting set and it's dark and getting darker, and eventually, this is early 2000s, not everybody had a mobile phone, right? But I proudly had one of those Nokia bricks that it was yellow and it had Snake on it. Remember playing that with the Nokia Snake game? And so myself and this young fella, we were just playing Snake on the phone. I said, mate, I'll be here, doesn't matter how long it'll be, I'll sit beside you, no dramas. Finally got onto the parents. It was just circumstantial that they couldn't actually communicate. Nothing disastrous had happened. It was just situation after situation, circumstance after circumstance. Anyway, they rocked up. Can you imagine the trust level that goes through the roof after something like that? So once 9/11 has happened, then this conversation now takes place. This company can start, and it's off the back of a contract which is still going today, right? But I don't get a brass razoo out of it. And so I remember at that time, once that contract came to fruition and I was helping deliver some of that content, that I just thought, I just want a piece of this. I get that it was off the back of a relationship, and it was through a relationship in this room here this evening all those years ago that helped me identify that it was off the back of a relationship that made that very thing possible. So I thought, I've got to get me some of this. So I need to learn business development. That's when I went into pharmaceuticals. And what happened within pharmaceuticals is one moment in time, it was the first example to me that technology is starting to replace things. And of course, it's not until hindsight you look back and you go, how obvious was that? But we were instructed at that time, we were all given PDAs, right? I even forget what stands for. With a stylus, and you'd tap on the screen and do stuff, right? So IT is my strength. So what would happen is we had personal digital assistant. Thank you. Yes. See, I told you this side is awesome. Isn't this section here? So what would happen is that you would implement a strategy into the retail pharmacies and on the different banner groups of pharmacies, and you would be able to communicate not just the order taking, but also the implementation, the finance, the different categories of things they were doing, their history, all sorts of stuff, and you'd be able to walk outside, you get reception, get in the right spot and press send, and somehow beam me up, Scotty got it, and back to the warehouse they knew, and then back to the data warehousing and to the head office. They knew all this data, which at that time was just different, unique and wonderful apparently. I remember the CEO of the company talking about this PDA strategy, and he said it's the companies that can communicate the fastest that will win. And as that thought unfolded, I got to share that thought again with some people in the room many years ago, and that was my first example of technology taking jobs, because that skipped about 3 or 4 people out of that traditional process. But it doesn't skip out trust. I mean, the trust to get that data to begin with is still there, right? It's still got to be on the back of a relationship. So all that to come round to say that the idea of trust, it's just interwoven intrinsically into what we do. And whilst we might all instinctively know this, let's continue to see what does trust mean, and maybe what the experts are saying themselves. There's Amy Cuddy, who's a psychologist with Harvard University. She's written a study. Now, if you allow me 2 minutes, I'm just going to read an article on this particular study, which itself is about trust. It's this is interesting. It'll take about 2 minutes for me to read it. People size you up in seconds, it starts with. But what exactly are they evaluating? Harvard Business School professor Amy Cuddy has been studying first impressions alongside fellow psychologists Susan Fiske, Peter Glick for more than 15 years, and have discovered patterns in these interactions. In her new book, Presence, Cuddy says people quickly answer 2 questions when they first meet you. Can I trust this person? And can I respect this person? Psychologists refer to these dimensions as warmth and competence, respectively, and ideally you want to be perceived as having both. Interestingly, Cuddy says that most people, especially in a professional context, get this, especially in a professional context, believe that competence is the more important factor. After all, they want to prove that they are smart and talented enough to handle your business. But in fact, warmth or trustworthiness is the most important factor in how people evaluate you. She says, from an evolutionary perspective, Cuddy says, it's more crucial to our survival to know whether a person deserves our trust. It makes sense when you consider that in caveman days it was more important to figure out if your fellow man was going to murder and steal all your possessions than if he was competent enough to build a good fire. While competence is highly valued, Cuddy says, it is evaluated only after trust is established, and focusing too much on displaying your strength can backfire. And it come across people like that who focus too much on their strength? Does it backfire or what? What's interesting is you look what's happening, particularly in professional social media pages such as LinkedIn, and you see these people spruiking themselves, and they even let video into the darn platform, and everyone now, not just written, but in their own face online, are telling you how good they are, alright? Wow. So, if someone you're trying to influence doesn't trust you, you're not going to get very far. In fact, you might even elicit suspicion because you come across as manipulative. Cuddy says a warm, trustworthy person who is also strong elicits admiration, but only after you've established trust does your strength become a gift rather than a threat. Isn't it interesting? These are what the professionals are saying. We all know this guy, Simon Sinek. Well, likely we would do. Start With Why, wonderful author. He come to fame, will come onto my radar when he was on TED, TED.com. There's some wonderful talks of his continuing on there as well. And he, as an anthropologist, that's where he started his life out. He studied humans, he studied their interactions, he deals with all the big... He's kind of the guy you want for culture, for understanding people, for shifting a traditional corporation into actually giving us stuff about people and doing something about it, right? He's the man. What he says is very interesting. The very survival of the human race, he says, depends on our ability to surround ourselves with people whom believe what we believe, or as he would say, who believe what we believe. You channel your inner Simon Sinek. When we are surrounded by people who believe what we believe, something remarkable happens. Trust emerges, right? The challenge is that takes time, doesn't it, in order for that to happen. So most people skip that process, go to beating their chest to tell you how good they are, and work on trust later on, right? Doesn't work like that. Not anything worthwhile works like that anyway. He uses a wonderful example in one of his talks about he says, if you were to consider, if your parents in the room consider your most valuable possession, he calls them possessions, what he's meaning is kids, right? As kids. Now, you've got a choice to make. He does this in front of many audiences, and this is, I'll give you the abbreviated version. He says, if you would imagine you needed a babysitter, you didn't have one. Now, you knew there was a 16-year-old down the street who's been in the community and the family for quite some time, and they were available, and they know everybody in the community. Then there's... It might be better. I'll yell until we get that fixed. So then there's a there's a 16-year-old, but there's also a 35-year-old that you've got their resume from, who's got 10 years of experience in actually babysitting, but you don't know them, where they've come from, their background, or who's recommended them, right? Who would you choose, parents? And he does this in front of the audience, and all the time you've everybody has to answer this yourself. It's a 16-year-old. You mean you're choosing a 16-year-old with no experience over a 32-year-old unknown but with experience? And we all choose your most valued possession, right, to have the 16-year-old. I think it's a fascinating example because that person comes with trust, comes with community, comes with a track record. Do you get what I'm saying? And so, if this is true, and we, again, instinctively know things like this are true, right, that we actually would rather trust the 16-year-old with a community that's been in that space for X amount of time, right, we know their history, you would trust that person, but why is it? What about this next example of what the experts are saying? And Stephen M.R. Covey, not to be confused with his father, Stephen Covey. No, this is the son. A very creative family. He's his book on the speed of trust. And every time he gets to speak, again, if you watch if you've seen any of his material, read his books, it boils down to be saying that people follow trusted leaders, not strategy. You could have a brilliant strategy, but if there's muppets running it, then it's not going to work, right? If there's people who have a strategy that on paper is 100% accurate, completely predictable, 100% predictable that the result will happen, mathematically proven, or however you want to do it, that the result will happen, but there are untrustworthy people driving that, we all know, if you had experience directly or indirectly or not at all with this, we all know what's going to happen with that strategy. It ain't going to work, is it? No. Right? You may have heard the example of results equals strategy times execution. It's still bandied around today, and it's still what a lot of organisations behave upon, right? And they build themselves on. They've got to get the best XYZ expert with the best strategy, and they focus on the strategy. They focus on the execution of their strategy because the consultant told so, and they paid a mozza for them, so they better follow it, right? What they're missing, again, according to your instincts, my instincts, and Stephen Covey, is that the difference is trust. Trust is a multiplier. It's strategy times execution multiplied by trust equals results, right? Are we building a good case here for trust? Right? I think we are. So if it's true that trust is that important, thanks mate. If it's true that trust is that important, I always like to ask people, well, what are you doing with trust? What are you doing to implement trust into what you're doing, we're talking commercially here. What are you doing to implement trust? What is the part of your process? Again, it's woven through all processes. But what is the examples you have as to how trust is being used in what you do day to day, right? Because trust is a feeling. And it's fascinating that you think of the best results and productivity come from a trusted relationship. You task somebody with that and you expect it to be done, right? And now there's a way to communicate that. Remember that example before, this is a good strategy, now do it. Well, that's not going to work well, right? But with a trusted leader imparting a good strategy, there is now trust in that person to actually execute that properly. Does that make sense? So what are we going to do? I want to encourage you to understand loud and clear that actually building trust is the strategy. And I find so many people in all walks of life and all levels of business park trust to the side and think it's something to do later. And they think their product, their service, their professional will be enough, that it will buy us enough time to get trust as we go along. What if you went the other way around? What if you invested time in creating trust first and proving yourself first and then worrying about business afterwards? What would happen? In fact, I'll tell you what will happen. It would be a multiplier to what you do. Having more trust in the relationships that you have, having more trustworthy people in what you do gets the results of business. Don't start with business and figure out trust later. We see where those organisations go, right? They become defunct. So the strategy to invest in, or let's have a think a bit of a strategy as we bring this home. excuse me, for a landing. Is when people hear that it is trust as a strategy we're trying to achieve, when people hear that, they often and understandably put that through the framework of what they already know, their career, their company, or something like that. And what we forget is that can work in those environments because they have leverage in an organisation. If Google wants to implement more trust in its perception of people with people, or in its services with people, it has many levers, much leverage, and things it can do to put trust in your eyes. Whether that be advertising, whether through buying a company that you trust, that you get warm and fuzzy feelings from, and that it's trustworthy by association. They've got so many things that they could do in order to earn your trust. But what about us individually? Because aren't we individually the ones that are actually driving the business and driving the outcomes? If we're just talking commercially, we can talk relationships, the same thing as well. But commercially, it's us individually, true? Yep. So what are you individually? If it's the thing, this is the part about pulling trust out of our brains and thinking about it. If the reality is that it is the thing that makes the difference, then what are we actually doing to make that the centre of our strategy? Not a byproduct of our strategy, or not something that happens along the way. I drink my water because I drink coffee. Like, it doesn't work that way, does it? Right? So what can we do to invest trust to create trust within our own personal brand you? And these are three things that I'd recommend for an intelligent strategy that intelligently places trust. What do I mean by that? Well, you don't want to give blind trust to people, a bit like that car situation at the front end, right? Is that if you blindly go, well, I guess I'll get it right with 19 because it'll mean more to them. It's like, no, mum was right, dad was right. If you can't look after your $3 worth of pocket money, you're not looking after the $1,000 this, or you're not looking. Do you get what I'm saying? You're not looking after your first paycheck. If you didn't save $1 of those $3, you're not saving the $1,000 paycheck you get. You get what I'm saying? No? So it's not blind trust, it's actually based on evidence. So what we need to work on, the first part of a strategy, is actually working on trustworthiness ourselves. Trustworthiness. Because what's happening if through your actions you're giving people the ammunition, the results in order to trust you. You're giving them the thing in which they can stand on a platform in order to trust you. It's their judgment call and whether they trust you or not. You can't tell someone to trust you. Does that make sense? So if it's somebody else's job, or if it's somebody else's power in order to determine whether they trust you or not, then we need to focus on trustworthiness, not trust. Does that make sense? If we trust blindly, it's going to go nowhere. So a smarter way to start is to work on trustworthiness. So how does that happen? Well, trustworthiness could be doing simple things like just following through on what you said you were going to do. I mean, if you just did that, could you pick the high percentage of people that you would be in? Like, you would be in the top
80. You've been the top 20%.
Top 20%.
What you said you do.
Easily, from a random poll, statistically, you would be in the top of a survey size of 1. I reckon it's much narrower than that. I wish if 20% of the people in life actually did what they say they were. You're doing very generous. You're very good with people. Clearly,
we're talking about trade.
That's right. Trade. Yeah, it depends on the industry. True. So wouldn't it be interesting that if the more people, where was I going with this? the more it was about trust, right? Anyway, so move on to the next one. So the other thing is about providing usable evidence for people. So here's a wonderful example in order to do that. If it's my personal brand that is at stake, and I want to meet a stranger and impart trust, I know, just like that sales guy, that they're going to be on their best behaviour if it's just me and them, particularly if they smell an opportunity. But if I can provide usable evidence and bring them into a room like this and connect them to somebody else, they can connect me to somebody else, right? There's value, there's intrinsic value that I actually now, they are starting to put down the bricks of a platform of trust which I get to choose to stand on. I deem you now trustworthy or on the road to trustworthiness. Does that make sense? Yeah. So one of the keys, and particularly with a room like this, is the way that you leverage it, the way that you bring people into this environment. It's a stepping stone in order to build trust. And isn't it true that events can do a lot more leverage than you can do on your own? I do a lot within the sporting space, in professional sport. And when I get to bring people along, and I get to, luckily enough, I'm fortunate enough to spend most of my time in one of the high-res suite, which they call at Suncorp Stadium, which is kind of the place to be, and all the hobnobs are there, and I shouldn't be, but I am, right? And you bring somebody into that space, right, who would not generally be part of that space, or who was in years gone by where they lost a relationship, and you can bring them back in there. I mean, it's not me doing the work, it's the environment. Like, I trust that environment to do its job that hands them back to me in such great condition. Does that make sense? And what happens to through their eyes, looking through the lens of trust at me? Doesn't it go through the roof? Doesn't that then make my next step with them easier? Does this make sense? Yeah. So in terms of providing usable evidence, it's about one of the ways you can do it. This is why I'm in love with a platform like this. You can bring people along to this in order to provide usable evidence. And the third thing as part of a strategy is make yourself vulnerable to the other party. What do I mean by that? It means that you have more to lose than they do. Or they stand more to win, would be a more positive way, than you stand to win out of their experience. And if we go back to the thing we have in common, which is this platform, this space, and we're here generally for networking or building relationships purposes, is that if you've gone out of your way and you've invited somebody here, and you might have seen the balloons on stage and the drum kit, right? You might have had a moment going, holy cow, that's not supposed to be there, but let's use it while it's there, right? You might have had a moment because you've invited somebody in here and you're going, what the hell is happening here tonight? Right? Hang around, you might say no. But you're making yourself vulnerable by bringing somebody into an environment in which you're expecting to meet expectations. And so you, by bringing people here, are making yourself more vulnerable. But isn't it true that with a good outcome, there's a decent speaker and a great environment and some good people, doesn't it make sense that it gives a chance to put trust at the very heart of what you're doing within your relationships? You try doing it on your own. And how many interactions does it take to really learn from someone, to get to know, like, and trust them if you're doing it on a one-on-one basis? It is a long, long strategy. And if it's built around your business card or your company and they trust you because of the company name, then you failed miserably. Yeah. It's got to be about you. The connection age means it has to be about you, not about the company. It's brand you that makes the difference, right? It's about building trust with yourself, trust around yourself. So just in bringing it home, leveraging this for me personally is, whilst I run a business development consultancy, I don't do any of my own business development. What happens is you're able to surround yourself with advocates, because over time you've invested in other people. You get to meet them, you get to know them, you get to like them, you get to trust them, and you get to learn what each other does. And they soon figure out, as hopefully you're trusted or you're advocating people within your life, you get to figure out that my process is enhanced when I put you into it. When I'm talking to somebody or looking at new opportunities and I add you to what I'm doing, and vice versa, that both of our strategies are greatly enhanced for it. Not because it's not about a commercial outcome, it's about enhancing the other person's experience, because that puts trust into the relationship. Does that make sense? So my challenge, I guess, my thing to leaving you with is about trust is not a token thing that you just happen to know that, yeah, as soon as you... Of course, the best business comes from people you get to know, like, and trust. But what does that mean? Like, how do you actually deliberately, consciously put that into what you're doing so that it's able to be enhanced? Does that make sense? We want to do deliberately what you know instinctively to be true, right? And this is a platform to make trust a deliberate part of your strategy.